Hello.
Hello. Oh, sorry.
Hey, this is Heather Stur.
This is John Kinder. Is that close enough? Oh, okay.
This is Robert Jefferson.
Oh.
Once again, who's John?
This is John Kinder.
Okay, and Robert?
This is Robert Jefferson.
Okay,
I should still be good, right?
you're good.
All right. Can everyone hear me? All right. Thank you all for attending, and thank you for your patience. All right, welcome everyone. First, I want to thank everyone who made this possible, especially Joe Fort and his crew, who've managed to put together this live stream, as well as being able to host this in person. So thank you for the magical work that you do. I want to thank Dr. Sylvester Johnson, the director of the Center for Humanities, for supporting this symposium. I want to thank Peter Potter with Virginia Tech Publishing for providing coffee and other treats. So please feel free to help yourself throughout the show, so to speak. Today we're going to talk about a new publication that was co-edited by myself and John Kinder called Service Denied: Marginalized Veterans in Modern American History from UMass Press. Our goal from the beginning of this project was to debunk what we have called the myth of the veteran's experience, the singular, the veteran. This is a monolithic trope that is supposed to represent the vast amount of perspectives, ideas, and shared experiences supposedly among all former military personnel. In doing so, we conceptualized a framework for thinking about all of the veterans who, because of race, gender, sexuality, physical or mental health conditions, and discharge status, have been marginalized by American institutions, erased in collective memory of war and military service, and denied the rights and benefits awarded for military service. Each author, three of whom are on this panel today, take a unique approach to understanding the history of marginalized veterans and the historical forces that shape their experiences. And I'm going to give them an opportunity to discuss the significance of their chapters and what hopefully others can take away from their approaches to understanding the past. I've always wanted to read briefly from my own book aloud, so forgive my self-indulgence for a moment. Above all else, we hope to use this book to unsettle assumptions about military veterans in American history. If we wish to grapple with the marginalization of certain groups of veterans, we must first acknowledge America's long history of social inequality at home and abroad. Only then can we begin to address the lingering effects of this history in the present, for it has been too long denied. I want to briefly introduce our speakers. Next to me, to my right, is Dr. Robert F. Jefferson, Jr., the Director of the Africana Studies Program and an Associate Professor of History at the University of New Mexico. Dr. Jefferson holds a PhD in African American history from the University of Michigan. His research focuses on the relationship between race, gender, and citizenship in the 20th century. He is the author of Fighting for Hope, African Americans in the 93rd Infantry Division in World War II and post-war America. That book was nominated for the William Colby Book Prize, and he is currently working on a very fascinating project titled Color and Disability: The Many Lives of Vasco Hell in 20th Century America. Dr. John M. Kinder, the lead co-editor of the volume, is the Director of American Studies and Associate Professor of History at Oklahoma State University. Just a quick shout out, he also served on my thesis as my outside member at Oklahoma State whenever I was completing a master's degree in English. A scholar of war and society, he is the author of Paying with Their Bodies: American War and the Problem of the Disabled War Veteran. He's also the co-editor, as I've mentioned, of Service Denied. His current projects include The Ark and the Flood: How Zoos Survived During World War II, a very fascinating topic, as well as They Are Dead and Yet They Live: Civil War Memories in a Polarized America. Finally, but certainly not least, Dr. Heather Marie Stur is a professor of history at the University of Southern Mississippi and a senior fellow in the Dell Center for the Study of War and Society. She is the author of several books, including Saigon at War, South Vietnam and the Global 60s, as well as the U.S. Military and Civil Rights Since World War II, and finally, Beyond Combat: Women and Gender in the Vietnam War Era. She's the co-editor of Integrating the U.S. Military, Race, Gender, and Sexual Orientation Since World War II. Dr. Stur is the author of numerous articles which have been published in the New York Times, Washington Post, BBC, among other prestigious publications. In 2013 and 2014, Dr. Stur was a Fulbright scholar in Vietnam, where she was a visiting professor on the Faculty of International Relations at the University of Social Sciences and Humanities at Ho Chi Minh City. She is currently writing a fourth book about General Buford Blunt and the U.S. Army's 3rd Infantry Division in the 2003 invasion of Iraq. As you can tell from my lengthy description of her work, she is quite the accomplished scholar. And yet, I want to thank all of these brilliant scholars for joining us today, as well as the students in the audience and the people on the live stream as well. Without further ado, I want to welcome Dr. Jefferson, and I'm going to set up his PowerPoint for him. Welcome, Dr. Jefferson.
I want to say thank you to the Center for Humanities, Jason Higgins, for inviting me to participate in what I think has been a very provocative, if not I would say a very insightful session this morning on veterans in history. I wish to open with a living under fire document of sorts. The title of my presentation is Bearing Witness to a Memoir of Courage, Jesse Frazier, World War I, and an African-American family's struggle for collective memory. I begin with this vignette, and just bear with me if you will. On September 4th, 1918, AEF Major General James Harbord basically wrote, "Diaries are forbidden to be kept near the front. They are likely to fall into enemy hands, as diaries by German soldiers are found to be one of the prolific sources of information obtained from prisoners of war. Every German soldier seems to keep one," end close quote. But in this, let's see if I get this correct. Here we go. This memoir, basically the unpublished memoirs of Jesse Frazier, written between 1917 and 1920, belie that. This memoir is significant for a number of reasons. First, despite the fact that military authorities barred soldiers from keeping diaries near the front lines, thousands of U.S. Servicemen, like Frazier, they simply ignored the ban. And they decided to write diaries and memoirs anyway. Frazier's memoir was extremely rare because it gives us a unique view, if you will, of the daily life, of his daily life from the moment that he was drafted into the U.S. Army through his daily, travails in his post-war life during the 1920s. But the source also, I think, provides us with a vivid window into how Black veterans translated their wartime aspirations into proto-political action, and also how their modes of behavior interface with collective memory. This, and when I look at this fills me with a great deal of humility, as well as it also makes you think about history as being a living, breathing document. This is the opening pages of Jesse Frazier's memoir. If you think about this, if we relied simply on the official record, very little is known about Jesse Frazier. But in many ways, his story corresponds with the African-American experience in the first half of the 20th century. He was born in 1888 in Charleston, South Carolina. He grew up in a working-class household. After dropping out of high school, Frazier became one of the 60,000 African-Americans who moved to Chicago, Illinois between 1914 and 1917. And if I had to describe him in any other way, he is an exemplar of the Great Migration. we think about the Great Migration, we think about the thousands of African Americans who streamed into America's northeastern, midwestern, and western industrial centers. But this I think he puts his thumbprint on history altogether. As I'm looking at this page, I'm also thinking about the fact that he had the consciousness to write down what was actually happening to him on a daily basis at a time when literacy was highly prized, but was in many places of the country largely barred from African Americans. So I provide this as a way of saying that the document in itself spoke to me across time and distance. At this particular moment, in this page, in this opening page here, Frazier, like so many of his cohorts, basically between the ages of 21 and 31, they faced the possibility of being drafted, enlisted, or volunteering to meet the country's call to service. In June of 1917, and it says there, you see it in the page there, he ventured to City Hall to register for military service, but he had feelings of foreboding and despair while basically standing before draft board members. You have to remember, at this time in basically in the American experience, racism was at its high tide. It was also a moment when Jim Crow was it was leaving its imprimatur on all phases of American life. And with that, although he was eager to do his part, he, like so many thousands of young African Americans, longed to stay with their family. And he was also painfully aware of the military's Jim Crow treatment of black troops. I think in these opening pages, they capture that feeling quite well. He is somebody who, he knows that this is something that is part of his family heritage, but at the same time, he knows that the country in itself has very little to give him. After being drafted in the U.S. Army, he goes on to be assigned to the 365th Regiment, and he's training at Camp Grant, Illinois. Camp Grant, by the way, happens to be like one of these, it is the crucible for which it is drawing upon all of these sectors of African American society seeking basically young men to serve. It brings them all together, and they're coming from, in this case, different parts of the region of the Midwest, and they are starting to bond over this idea of military service. He found military service and discipline so much to his liking that he was promoted to corporal in his company and also earned the grudging respect of his fellow soldiers within the weeks of his promotion. But also, he also was somebody who was a pugilist. He was a boxer. And in the way that his uncle described him basically decades later, he was somebody who was of great physicality. That is, he wanted to prove himself in the ring as much as possible. And this seems to be, and when I thought about this seems to be like a rite of passage for many young African Americans during this period, because later on in the Second World War, we see this sort of thing happening as well. He enters basically the U.S. Army. He trains at Camp Grant, Illinois, and he's training there before basically being assigned to Europe. His ideas about race and manhood are dramatically transformed as a result of that. For instance, he goes to basically France. He is encountering what he considers to be parts of the old Napoleonic era barracks. They are living there, they're stationed there. And while he's there, he and many young African Americans are encountering what is a new world in the making. They see basically French inhabitants who are coming and coming to greet them, to talk with them, even though they couldn't understand the language. And in another piece, I talk about how translation was done for these soldiers and then also their civilian counterparts through gestures and also through movements that were seen as being very much friendly. But at the same time, through this interaction, these moments of interaction, they are becoming what they consider to be world citizens. They see a new world in the making. They see new opportunities basically opening up for them. And they are heartened by this. But it's also in a short period of time after they get there, they are also put through additional training. And this additional training awakens them to the fact that these are moments in which life and death basically stood right in front of them. And in his memoir, he captures this quite well because he talks about in ways in which many of you probably have experienced an unfamiliar environment, the great excitement of the opportunities that this unfamiliar environment basically offers you. And then there's also that moment of thinking about the dangers that are laying ahead for them. We all do this, but he does this, and he's quite mindful to record this for posterity. All of these experiences are then also added to the moments in which they are placed under fire, in which one of the fateful battles in which he takes part in, his commanding officer is wounded. He immediately assumes command of his company, and he performs quite well. And this is something that he is talking about in his memoir as well, because it brings him a great deal of satisfaction that he is performing very well under pressure. But shortly afterwards, when they are getting ready to board ships to go home, they are confronted with the prospects of what home is going to mean for them. Now, this American society, even though they basically perform well under pressure and so forth, they knew that American society was not prepared for them. This new human being that had been made, reshaped by the very harsh vigors of war in itself. They knew the harsh realities of American racism were just waiting for them. And this is something that he talks about as well. I'm going to depart from what I've been talking about right now to talk about their expectations, because as they find that their expectations are not being met, and through many instances, for instance, for him, on the journey back home, they're encountering towns and villages that are saying they do not accept Negro soldiers, do not look here for basically opportunities, but discard, and also their company commanders are telling them to discard their weapons as well as their uniforms so they're not becoming moving targets. And this is something that is also, it is also bombarding their senses. It's also challenging them to say, what kind of America are we re-entering? Is it the same America? And if it is, what do we do in order to figure out what our place is going to be in this new world? He gets back home to Chicago. They're greeted by loved ones through a parade and so forth. And these questions are now expanding for them. The questions that they have are now also being basically replicated in their conversations with their family members. Because what are they asking them? So what happened to you over there? What do you plan to do now that you're home? That question came up a lot for him. And he meets his hometown sweetheart, who he promptly marries. But then he discovers, basically during this period, that he can't provide a livelihood for them. He can't give them a sense of, provide a living for them because he cannot get a job. There's incessant unemployment during this period I'm talking about, the late 1918, early 1919 period. And not only that, but they're finding that the status of veterans does not confer to them the things that they expected to find once they returned home. It's only after basically a certain period that goes by that he's able to land work in, of all places, the post office. The U.S. Post Office, and I said this morning, it is seen by Frazier and other basically black veterans as being the university. It is the finishing place where they see that much of postal service work is very much akin to military service, from basically the donning of uniforms, which they wore, to the discipline and the culture and discipline that was there in the post office, and then also the Jim Crow racism that was also a part of the postal life as well. At the time when he is entering the post office, he's also encountering other veterans who served along with him in this unit, the 365th. And they have these conversations about what life meant to them prior to the war, what their expectations were basically during their military service, and then what they found when they returned home. At the same time this is happening, there are basically the storm clouds of race pogroms, riots that are taking place throughout the summer of 1919. And Chicago happens to be like one of the hotbeds of where this is happening. As they're hearing these rumors of the uprisings that are possibly awaited them, they start to talk about how they're going to organize to deal with this. They're going to defend their homes first. They're talking about their neighborhoods, their respective neighborhoods, what they're going to do. In many cases, some of them are even resorting to thinking about strategies of armed resistance to deal with what's going to happen. For Frazier himself, the first and the last place that he thinks about is his neighborhood and his family, taking care of his wife, who is then at that time expecting their first child. But then something happens to him when he's going on that fateful day when the race riots occur. He finds out that he's going to be reassigned to another post office. And he couldn't understand for the life of him why this was happening at this particular moment. And that is where the veterans' experiences and also this new Negro movement basically converge, because it's out of the crucible of this Jim Crow racism and the like, and also the new world that they saw coming into being that they wanted to be a part of, that they started to develop a new sense of themselves. And that's what my chapter is all about, is this new sense that they had. In many ways, the new Negro movement was one that interfaced with a lot of other basically travails that were happening in American society. But at the same time, it was centering them in the very communities that they chose to defend in uniform. So with that said, I come to this picture. I'm fast forwarding now. I'm letting you take place in time, give you a sense of time travel. This picture is a picture that spoke to me when I was asked to come here, because one, it resonated with what basically Jesse Frazier's World War I actions and thoughts, what they basically unveiled for somebody like me at this time. This was a photo that was taken of two World War II veterans. The first one on the left there, the gentleman in the blue and white striped shirt, is John Howard. John Howard, he, along with Reuben Frazier, who's next to him, served in the 93rd Infantry Division, which was the subject of my first book. He was one of the youngest, basically, officers in the division during the war. In fact, he was commissioned as a second lieutenant at the age of 19. He was a very reserved gentleman. He said very little, but when he spoke, his words carried a lot of weight. The next individual that I have for you is of special interest to this talk today. That is Reuben Frazier. That is the nephew of Jesse Frazier. Reuben Frazier is very interesting because he was a native of St. Louis, Missouri, at the time when his uncle was living. His uncle basically talked to him about his wartime, his World War I experiences, but he also shared his recollections about the Chicago race riots and what that was all about. and how he felt about it. Frazier himself, Mr. Frazier, they called him Rookie. That was his nickname. He comes from a long line of African Americans who served in the U.S. military. His grandfather fought in the Spanish-American War. I mentioned his uncle before, but he, like his uncle, also fashioned his own response to Jim Crow racism. For instance, in 1943, he ordered his men to bury an ammunition depot during desert maneuvers after his superiors ordered them to unload supplies. 8 months later, after disobeying another direct order, he finds himself in the Philippines. He disobeys a direct order. He is then ordered to construct his own stockade in New Guinea. After discovering that he supplied his disciplinary barracks with running water and electricity, his company commander didn't know what to do with him and decided, that they were going to requisition that back from him. They took it away from him. He said he was going to be in there, he would fix it up perfectly. That was his response to that. So he had his own way of dealing with this. His military career came to an abrupt end in 1945 when he wrote a letter. He had the temerity to write a letter to the War Department, basically protesting against the War Department's racial policies in the Pacific. Which leads me to my final point here. Take a look at this. Here's a mantle that was on display during my interview with Mr. Frazier here. As you'll see, there are photographs of Mr. Frazier there, and basically in the centerpiece there. The other one, basically at the top right there, is his wife, Zola Lang. Zola Lang, by the way, really interesting person because she served in the Army Nurse Corps during the Second World War. Her unit was the one that was deployed to Liberia during the war itself. And her recollections are, if you ever want to read about what it's like to be an African American basically in Africa during all of this upheaval happening, she talks about that very vividly. But back to this. I walk in and I see this as I'm talking to him. And he's saying to me, and in fact, there's his discharge papers right there to the right, the immediate right. He says to me, and at the time I was revising my dissertation into what became Fighting for Hope, he proudly mentions to me that his granddaughter had just graduated from the Air Force Academy. And that was a moment of great pride and also joy for his family, because his daughter was there, who happened to be the person who graduated. She was also standing there, and they were all both beaming with a lot of pride. But at this time, he's asking me, so how is our book coming along? So if you can imagine, for somebody like me, I'm writing a dissertation, I'm thinking, I have advisors that I'm trying to, I wanted to make sure that I met all of the things that they were asking for me, and then I'm getting this on top of that. That's an awesome responsibility, folks. I thought I was not going to live up to it. In fact, as he's talking to me, he says, wait a minute. He says, Jefferson, I got something for you. He goes in the back, he comes out, and he brings out this trudge of memoirs. And he says to me, so once you finish this, you're going to have to write about my uncle. And I'm thinking, and in fact, he says, he extracts a promise from me saying, you're going to write about, before you write about me, you're going to have to basically research and write about my uncle. And so I made a promise to him, and I said, I'm going to keep this promise. So that article that you see basically in this collection is the beginning of fulfilling that promise. And these, by the way, folks, these guys are not somebody you want to, how do I want to put this? You do not want to let them down, because they put a great deal of faith and trust into what you're doing. Then he proceeded to ask me also, so what are your plans for the next 3 books that you're going to be writing? I didn't have a clue as to what that meant. So I'm saying this because even though he passed away in 2004 at the age of 88, I wanted to say to him, if he was out there in the audience, and he is in this room, I know, that I have fulfilled my promise, and his uncle has now basically taken on basically the embodiment of all of the things that his family has stood for. Thank you very much.
Hello, everyone. Unfortunately, I don't have a nice PowerPoint to share, so I'm going to have to do the best I can. And please forgive me if I wind up reading some of this. But I do want to thank Dr. Jason Higgins and Virginia Tech Center for the Humanities for having me here. In my brief time today, I want to talk about bodily fluids. Right, so right now, all of us, me, you, right, Jason, right, all of us, right, all of us are emitting fluids from our bodies, right? Sweat, tears, snot, pus from open sores, blood from near invisible skin lesions, gastric juices burped up from lunch, perhaps, and of course, urine and liquid fecal matter seeping into our clothing. And you know, I get it. We don't like to talk about these things, right? So for all of their normality, right, for all of their ubiquity, bodily fluids are abject, right? That means they remind us of our animality. They remind us of the permeable nature of the line between inside our body and outside our body, right? And more than anything else, though, bodily fluids are gross. Bodily fluids are vaguely inappropriate. Bodily fluids are things not to be associated, not to be acknowledged in polite company such as this. Thus, you probably wouldn't be surprised to learn then that as far back as World War II, if not earlier, a uniformed soldier could be judged unsuitable for service. And that would be the term, unsuitable for service, for expressing the wrong bodily fluid at the wrong time or in the wrong place. So my unique contribution to this volume looks at the tens, if not hundreds of thousands of US troops separated from service following a diagnosis of enuresis, or what most of us call bedwetting. Right? So during World War II, the US Army alone dismissed some 356,000 enlistees for some combination of bedwetting, inaptness, or perceived incompatibility. The three were often collapsed together, right? And this is at a time when the US desperately needed warm bodies to fight Axis forces in the Atlantic and the Pacific. So of course, all of this begs the question, you know, what's the big deal about the occasional piss-colored blanket in a conflict that would see millions of gallons of blood, sweat, and effluent spilled on the battlefield, right? Well, a lot, it turns out, right? So at the time, World War II era military physicians cited the importance of hygiene, and this is a term loaded with racial and sexual judgments, when banning bedwetters, right? They also cited group morale. And again, you know, we can think about all the groups in American history who have been denied participation in the military because of they will upset morale, right? Women, people of color, queer people, transgender people, the list goes on, right? Morale is, you know, we don't want to upset morale. Bedwetting was also associated with delinquency, specifically attempting to shirk one's duty. an association that lingers to this day. In fact, I was presenting a version of this chapter to the Naval War College, and the head of the college, when heard about it, she said, people wet the bed, they're just trying to get out of duty, right? So, this still occurs. Above all, however, anti-bedwetting discourse took refuge in the language of a peculiar kind of Freudian psychology, right? One that framed enuresis as a sign of various, quote, underlying mental conditions, such as inadequate maturation, which is military speak for childishness, mental deficiency, or even psychopathy, right? And it really didn't matter whether you wet the bed during the first day of boot camp, or whether you wet the bed or one's enuresis revealed itself in the aftermath of trauma, such as surviving a bomb attack. In the eyes of the military, bedwetters were bedwetters, right? They belonged to an amorphous category of unwanted troops, the so-called psychiatric unfit, whose members also included gays and lesbians, men who displayed, quote, recognized queerness, and enlistees who exhibited silly, inappropriate laughter, right? And as one might imagine, a diagnosis of enuresis with all its various connotations could haunt a former soldier for decades, right? So in the years following World War II, stigmas against bedwetting, along with the fact that accused bedwetters frequently received less than honorable dismissals, meant that they were broadly marginalized both within mainstream society and within the veteran community, right? Many enuretic vets had minimal contact with the VA, the Veterans Administration, and the various programs it offered discharged troops. Enuretic vets were also virtually invisible in post-World War II popular culture, despite the thousands of military-themed entertainments produced over the past 70 years. I mean, think about it. How many movies have you ever seen that involve people wetting the bed, right? Military movies. I can think of one, right? So some spent decades fighting in Veterans Appeals Court to gain some kind of service recognition for their conditions, many of which first emerged, and this is key, after near-death experiences on the battlefield or after violence at the hands of their fellow men in uniform. One Marine I profiled, and his name was withheld from the public records, he protested that his enuresis first developed following the brutal treatment of his drill sergeant in boot camp, and not, as the military claimed, in childhood. What followed was a half-century of marginalization and misery. Denied a service connection for anxiety reaction in 1954, he struggled to find permanent work. By the 70s, he was an alcoholic, unemployed, living on the streets, and on top of the persistent enuresis, he was diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia. And all this time, right, all the while he is in the courts, right, he is in the Veterans Appeals Courts trying to apply to the VA for some kind of help, but with little to no luck. Finally, in March 2002, roughly 50 years after he was initially booted out of uniform for wetting the bed, the military recognized a service connection between his nocturnal bedwetting and traumas he endured while in service. And this Marine, he's not alone. If anything, he's typical. So to be sure, things are getting better, right? In 1976, just a few years after the end of the United States' failed campaign in Vietnam, the Department of Defense discarded bedwetting as a category of unsuitability, redefining it instead as a, quote, non-volitional medical problem, right? A term that was sort of meant to avoid any sense of moral judgment. In the decades since, growing numbers of veterans and veterans advocates have worked to destigmatize enuresis in all its forms. And younger vets in particular have turned to online spaces, forums, chat rooms, that sort of thing, to out themselves as present and former bedwetters, and to share tips for managing the situation. Nevertheless, as of the 2010s, enuresis remained on a list of conditions, including fear of flying, fear of submarines, wool allergies, sleepwalking, and razor bumps, considered worthy of, quote, separation by reason of convenience of the government. All right, so, why is all of this important, right? Why should we care about this? And how can it help us understand the lives of other veterans marginalized because their experiences, their bodies, their disabilities don't align with those typically viewed in Hollywood movies and military recruitment ads? Well, for starters, I hope we come away with a greater sense of skepticism, right? Skepticism about what the military and American society as a whole takes as common sense, right? Our squeamishness about urine and the associations that many people have with bedwetting, these things aren't rooted in science, right? They're not rooted in critical thinking. Now and then, ideas about bedwetting and bedwetters are shaped by other sorts of prejudice, right? Prejudice against people whose bodies resist social discipline, right? Prejudice against people whose bodies remind us of the corporeality, right, which is a fancy word of saying the embodiedness we are trying so desperately to suppress, right? Moreover, I think it's important to remember that veterans policy has always been weighted toward populations whose bodies and bodily functions align with social, cultural, and biophysical norms. Those that don't, again, women, people of color, transgender individuals, and yes, people who wet the bed, have been deemed morally unfit or constitutionally unsuitable for military service. Finally, I hope we can take a tough look at our own assumptions about what's gross, right? What's abject, right? What's not to be discussed in polite company. In a culture that revels in blowing holes in the bodies of our enemies, cutting them down with machine gun fire, and liquefying their insides in drone attacks, I think it's morally unconscionable to fret about peeing the bed. And I hope you do too. Thanks.
I'm sure that all of my students can tell how important it was that John, Kendra, and I partner on this project because I have no sense of humor of which I'm aware. Dr. Stur.
Well, those are both awesome. Really great talks. Thank you so much to Dr. Jason Higgins for convening the symposium. And also thank you to the Virginia Tech Center for the Humanities for its support of this. And thank you to everyone for coming, especially the students, because I know you're staring down the end of the semester. So thank you for taking some time out of wrapping up papers and starting to study for finals and all of that to be here with us today. It's great to be here with John and Robert and learn about the parallels and the differences between various veterans' experiences, which is the purpose of the symposium, to like as Jason said in his introduction, to break down the idea of this monolithic veteran experience and see all of the very different ways that veterans have experienced their life after their military service and after war. My portion of this panel is going to focus on LGBTQ veterans, and I came to this topic through a broader interest in the integration of the U.S. military over time, and also in the interplay between law and culture. So exploring how legal changes don't necessarily change cultural attitudes, and how mindset changes can take longer. And they can happen, but the process isn't as straightforward as policy change. So I'm going to start with a very brief history of LGBTQ military service, and then I'll get into veterans' experiences and responses to issues of discrimination against LGBTQ military service. So from the time of the Continental Army in the 18th century into the 20th century, the U.S. military based its exclusion of gay service members on sodomy. So sodomy was punishable by court-martial, and then a service member would receive a dishonorable discharge. Now, sodomy laws applied to all Americans regardless of sexual orientation, and the point really was to punish sexuality and sexual activity outside of marriage, any sexual activity that was not procreative. So these laws weren't targeted at gay and lesbian service members, but those were they formed the basis upon which the military would dishonorably discharge LGBTQ service personnel. In the 1940s, the branches of the military began to screen inductees for what they termed homosexual tendencies. I mean, a lot of parallels between what's going on here and what John just talked about in terms of framing these issues as mental deficiencies or deviances. So, quote, homosexual tendencies were considered to be mental deviances and used to prevent LGBTQ Americans from enlisting in the military. They were considered unfit for service, again, a lot of the similar language that John used. And this was, again, to prevent gay people from entering the service. These efforts occurred in the women's auxiliaries as well. For example, the Women's Army Corps, which was created during World War II to be able to mobilize women for service, very strictly enforced gender conformity, so conforming to the accepted conventional feminine gender roles for service members in the Women's Army Corps, and also encouraging service women to engage in heterosexual relationships with servicemen to dispel any, or to create an image that would dispel any concerns that the American public had that the Women's Army Corps would become a haven for lesbians, which was a major concern among the American public when the Women's Army Corps was created. During World War II, commanders took to issuing what were referred to as blue discharges to remove LGBTQ service members from the military. Now, they were called blue because of the color of paper that those discharges happened to be printed on. Prior to World War II, discharge would occur through charges brought to a court-martial, and then the discharge would be handed down from there. But because the U.S. was at war just during World War II, it became the process of calling a court-martial was not something that was possible. And so the military gave commanders the authority to issue what were called administrative discharge. And these were these blue discharges that could be used for any kind of behavior that was considered to be conduct unbecoming, not fit for service. They weren't specifically aimed at gay and lesbian service members, but these were the types of discharges that were issued. They were at the discretion of the unit commander, and there was no right to appeal. During World War II, about 9,000 men and women received blue discharges because of their sexuality. Now, this is not the largest number of service personnel who received these. Actually, the largest number of service personnel who received blue discharges during World War II were black men. About 50,000 black men received these discharges. So again, these aren't aimed specifically at LGBTQ service personnel, but it's the type of discharge that was used at that time. Even though these weren't dishonorable, so they're called less than honorable discharges, they still prevented veterans who received these types of discharges from getting the GI Bill and other types of VA benefits like home loans and health care. So they did have a major impact on veterans' lives after they were separated from the military. And in the aftermath of World War II, this was particularly harmful to gay and lesbian veterans because it was a time period where there was widespread throughout U.S. society persecution of gays and lesbians. They were ostracized in their communities, attacked for being who they were, violence enacted upon gays and lesbians, inability to get jobs because of their sexual orientation. So having a blue discharge on their record made that context even worse. Now, some veterans did organize and try to fight back. If you see the image here, the first image on my slide, this is Dale Jennings, who he served in World War II. He was a Marine who served at Guadalcanal and earned several medals and distinctions, including a Bronze Star. He was discharged from the military honorably, so he served closeted. But after his service, he was one of the founders of an organization called the Veterans Benevolent Association, which was founded by several gay veterans, all of them who had actually been discharged honorably. So they hadn't faced these legal issues, but they knew of what was happening to their counterparts. And so they created the Veterans Benevolent Association to provide a space where gay and lesbian veterans could come together and talk about their experiences, and also to get legal advice about how for those who did receive blue discharges, about what to do. So they created a legal arm in order to try and address that type of discrimination. It wasn't a very large group. There were about 100 members at the group's peak. But again, it was an example of LGBTQ veterans coming together, realizing the impact of discrimination on their lives after the service, and trying to figure out ways to help each other get through it, if not get over it, get beyond it, because again, there was no appeal process at that time for blue discharges. Now, factionalism and tension among the leaders eventually led to the Veterans Benevolent Association breaking apart in 1954, but some of the members moved into civilian organizations, including the Mattachine Society, which was an early gay activist organization in the 1950s. And so this is an example of how the military services of gay veterans shaped gay activism in the civilian world in the post-World War II era. The VBA was also a precursor to later groups such as the Servicemen's Legal Defense Network, which I'll talk about in a little bit. The U.S. military continued to codify its discrimination against LGBTQ personnel after World War II. So a couple of specific details on that. In 1949, the Department of Defense issued a policy across service branches that banned gay people from the armed forces and required that service members who were discovered to be gay would be discharged. And so this is prior to World War II, the branches of the military were separated out. There wasn't a unified Department of Defense, but now that there was one in the post-World War II era, that centralized institution could create this blanket policy for all the services. And then in 1951, the Uniform Code of Military Justice was implemented, and Article 125 banned sodomy. So anti-gay legal efforts were tied to broader assertions in the U.S. intelligence community in the post-World War II era, especially in the 50s and early 60s, that these assertions accused gay people of being security risks. And this speaks back to that tie-in with mental deviance and sexual deviance, and that the use of the term sex pervert was one that was often applied to LGBTQ Americans, that they were somehow mentally deficient or disordered because of their sexual orientation, and therefore were security risks. So discussions of gay people being more susceptible to blackmail and not having the mental capacity to handle having a security clearance. And so, again, these efforts to discriminate against gay service personnel paralleled these other discriminatory efforts by the U.S. government in the civilian context. Now, even in the military, there were efforts to try and study and see whether these accusations actually held up. So, for example, in 1957, the Navy commissioned a study of the Defense Department's anti-gay policies, and the resulting report was known as the Crittenden Reports. It's named after the person who was the chairman of the committee that did the report. His name was S.H. Crittenden, Navy captain. The Crittenden Report, and this is 1957. The Crittenden Report concluded that there was no factual evidence to support the accusation that gay people posed any type of security threat. In 1957, I mean, this is stunning to think about that when we think about the fact that Don't Ask, Don't Tell, ended in 10 years ago, a little more than 10 years ago. I'll get to that. But the Crittenden Report also stopped short of calling for policy change. So it stated that, in its conclusion, that the armed forces shouldn't move ahead of civilian society or set different standards for acceptance of gays and lesbians. So this is an example of maybe a missed opportunity by the Navy and the Defense Department to make change that could have been on the leading edge of what was going on, or to lead the civilian world in terms of more acceptance and an end to discrimination against gay personnel. Now, the Defense Department actually suppressed the Crittenden Report, so it wasn't made known until 1976 when some attorneys requested it through a Freedom of Information Act. So it ended up being suppressed for almost 20 years. One of the most high-profile, let's see here. one of the most high-profile challenges to the military's discrimination against LGBTQ service personnel came in 1975 from an Air Force sergeant named Leonard Matlovich, and so you can see him pictured here. He came out as gay to his superiors and filed a lawsuit against the Department of Defense for its ban on gays in the military. Matlovich and his lawyers fought for 5 years, arguing that the military's ban on gays and lesbians was a violation of due process and equal protection. This was the same argument that was made against the limiting of black soldiers' military service until that was repealed or until the military was fully integrated after World War II. I'm going to read you a quote which shows that people in power were even thinking about this parallel. So the judge that heard Matlovich's case, his name was Gerhard Gesell. This is a quote that he said during that trial. "No one who has studied the civil rights movement and the striving of blacks for opportunity will ever fail to recognize that the armed forces, more than any branch of the government and far ahead of the private sector in this country, led to erasing the stigma of race discrimination. Here, another opportunity is presented." So he's kind of talking about this opportunity that the military has to be ahead of the civilian world in terms of erasing discrimination, removing discrimination. But even, just like the Crittenden report, makes these claims, but even Gesell decided to leave the fate of gays in the military to Pentagon officials. And so he didn't vote to overturn the military's policy regarding gays in the military. And so in 1980, after 5 years of fighting, Matlovich gave up the fight and accepted a settlement and an honorable discharge. A year after Matlovich left the Air Force, a U.S. Army staff sergeant by the name of Perry Watkins challenged the Army's discrimination against LGBTQ personnel. So Watkins' case is really interesting, and it's an example that shows how the military's policy on LGBTQ service members was fluid depending on the wartime or peacetime context. Watkins joined the Army in 1967 at the height of U.S. escalation of the Vietnam War. He was 19. He came out to one of his commanders. He came out to an Army psychiatrist, but he was allowed to enlist anyway, and he was serving openly, basically, in his tour of duty. In 1970, he re-enlisted with the knowledge of his sexuality, and he was able to re-enlist. Again, the U.S. is at war in Vietnam. So he continued to serve, but then in 1980, the Defense Department revoked his security clearance, and he was discharged from the Army. 1980, the U.S. isn't in a major war anymore. And so again, Watkins' case demonstrates that the Army either doubles down on its policies of discrimination against LGBTQ personnel, or it looks the other way if it needs personnel. And again, Watkins is an example of that. He went to court to fight his discharge also, but after 2 years of fighting, courts were not willing to overturn the discharge, and so he also eventually walked away from his legal battle. Another example of the fluidity, and this actually takes us back a little bit, of the military's response to sexual orientation. So in the Korean War, in 1951, the Navy discharged about 500 soldiers for sexual orientations. 1951, Korean War. 1953, when the war was over, that amount doubled. So U.S. isn't at war. The Navy is doubling the number of soldiers sailors that are discharged because of sexual orientation. And then those types of discharges for sexual orientation didn't drop below 500 again until the Vietnam War. So very clear connection to whether the U.S. needs personnel or not because the U.S. is at war. In 1988, a Defense Department agency that was called the Defense Personnel Security Research Center conducted another study on these assumptions about gay personnel posing security risks and having other negative impacts on military units. So, John mentioned the unit cohesion, morale, and all of this. These exact same language is used to justify LGBTQ exclusion from the military. This study also found that sexual orientation was unrelated to military job performance. So this is the second study conducted by a Defense Department by some kind of Defense Department organization that, again, is concluding that these assumptions about gay personnel are unfounded. Conclusion pointed to the military's previous discrimination against black soldiers, and it argued that once black soldiers were integrated into the military, none of the concerns that had been mentioned came to fruition. The Pentagon rejected these findings. So another report, another rejection of the findings. But the portions from that report, the 1988 report, were actually used in the early 1990s when Congress began to debate the ideas that eventually would be codified in Don't Ask, Don't Tell. And I'll say a little bit more about that in a few minutes. In 1990, a group of LGBTQ veterans founded an organization called the Gay, Lesbian, and Bisexual Veterans of America. It was later renamed the American Veterans for Equal Rights. One of the founders was a veteran by the name of Miriam Ben Shalom. She enlisted in the Army in 1974 and was discharged in 1976 when it was revealed that she's a lesbian. She did receive an honorable discharge, but she was discharged. And she took the Army to court. And her case went back and forth. In 1980, there was a judgment in the U.S. District Court of Chicago that ruled that her discharge was unconstitutional. But legal battles kept on going back and forth. There was a moment where she was reinstated. So some historians consider her to be the first and maybe only person who received a discharge from the military for their sexual orientation to actually be reinstated. But then she was discharged again as her case continued to battle out through the courts. And then in 1990, the U.S. Supreme Court refused to hear the case, and that ended her military career. But she did fight it out in the courts and did have some success. And we can see that there's not even a clear sense in the various court systems on how to handle this type of discrimination. And what the courts were often doing were kind of leaving up to the military and sort of deferring to the military to decide what is the best course of action for cohesion, morale, and those sorts of arguments, despite the evidence that had come out in some of these reports. But anyway, by 1990, Ben Shalom's military career had ended. But she continued to be an activist for LGBTQ service personnel and veterans. She protested against Don't Act, Don't Tell until it was repealed in 2011. In 1993, the Rand Corporation commissioned a study under President Bill Clinton, who he had been, gay activists had put pressure on him to make the military get rid of its discrimination against LGBTQ personnel. And so he, in his trying to come up with a plan to do that, he commissioned a study by the Rand Corporation that examined, some of the evidence that had come out in these other reports and studies of gay people in the military. And this Rand Corporation came to the same conclusions as previous studies, which is that there was no evidence that gay and lesbian personnel posed any kind of security risk. But Clinton went with Don't Ask, Don't Tell as a compromise between the LGBTQ activists and those who opposed gay and lesbian service in the military. And that was the Don't Ask, Don't Tell policy, which said that a gay person could serve in the military as long as you remained in the closet. And if it was discovered that you're gay, then you are to be discharged from the military. In response to that, in 1993, an organization called Service Members Legal Defense Network was created, and it provided nonprofit legal services to help gay and lesbian military personnel and veterans deal with harassment and discharge under the Don't Ask, Don't Tell policy. So another example of both gay and lesbian veterans, LGBTQ veterans, and also activists in the civilian world coming together to try to provide legal services for those who are faced with discrimination and harassment because of military policy. Now, since the repeal of Don't Ask, Don't Tell, the Veterans Administration has implemented programs to address the needs of LGBTQ veterans, which includes helping vets work through the trauma of having served closeted. veterans can also apply to have their blue discharges upgraded to honorable so that they could receive VA benefits. Because if someone still has one of those blue discharges, they can't receive veterans benefits, but they now can appeal and then be able to have access to those benefits. Political changes in the US regarding LGBTQ rights also have shaped VA policies. For example, the 2015 case of Obergefell versus Hodges, which was the Supreme Court case that ruled same-sex marriage to be legal and must be recognized in all 50 states, pushed the VA, or I guess maybe we could say open the door for the VA to extend spousal and family benefits to LGBTQ veterans and their spouses and children. So those are now available. Again, that's another one of those connections between political happenings in the civilian world and then also military policymaking. The mental toll of serving closeted and the physical toll of avoiding health care for fear of being outed or having to lie about illness have resulted in various kinds of problematic health trends for LGBTQ veterans that the VA is beginning to try to pay attention to, as well as non-governmental healthcare advocacy groups that focus on the needs of LGBTQ Americans in general. Despite the VA's efforts to offer inclusive care, some LGBTQ veterans have said that they're still afraid to disclose their sexual orientation to VA healthcare providers out of fear that they will lose their benefits. And this is one of those psychological effects of decades of discrimination, that even with policy in place, there's still worry about other types of discrimination that might happen against them. Again, being conditioned because of so many years and decades of discrimination. I'm going to wrap up here. So one of the lessons that we learn from studying the experiences of LGBTQ veterans is that legal recognition isn't the end. It's just the beginning of a long process that includes dealing with the impact of the past and working to change contemporary culture towards acceptance. Even with legal rights and legal protections, some LGBTQ service personnel and veterans still face harassment and discrimination. Some veterans are plagued with anxieties that stem from the Don't Ask, Don't Tell era and before. These are issues that other marginalized veterans face too. Even as we recognize their different contexts, we still can see some parallels in their experiences. Now, we could see this history as a history of progress in certain ways to a point. So we could look at someone like Pete Buttigieg, for example. He is a veteran of the war in Afghanistan. He was a presidential candidate. He is now transportation secretary. Those accomplishments were made possible in part because of legal changes. I mean, we could see a parallel there in terms of the experiences of Black service personnel and veterans, someone like Lloyd Austin, who is now Secretary of Defense. I mean, again, because of legal changes, opened the door for these kinds of major accomplishments for individuals like Buttigieg and Austin. But we also need to pay attention to things like, in terms of the LGBTQ veteran context, higher rates of suicide and other health issues among the broader population of LGBTQ veterans, to know what work still needs to be done to create both a more inclusive military and a more inclusive public idea of who American soldiers are. So that's part of the inclusivity too, not just the institutional side, but also the cultural side of including, expanding who we as Americans think are our soldiers and our veterans. Now these issues are more complicated because legal and policy changes don't necessarily fix them. There are cultural and mindset issues at play, including how heterosexual people continue to view LGBTQ veterans, and also how LGBTQ veterans think about themselves and their service in light of past discrimination and harassment. The history of transgender military service also reminds us that, or how easily legal rights can actually be reversed. President Obama made it legal for transgender personnel to serve openly in the military, but then President Trump repealed that, and so for a time, transgender people were banned from serving openly. So legal rights can be reversed, and we get a reminder there too. So ultimately, these histories and lessons apply not just to the US military, but also to US history and our contemporary experience at large. The histories of marginalized veterans aren't just military histories. They're encapsulated histories of American society, politics, and culture. Thank you.
At this moment, I want to transition to a more conversational format. Please take a moment, get more coffee, sugar, whatever it takes to keep you here for another 30 minutes. And I hope you have lots of questions. If not, I have a couple backup. That was almost the cover image. John Kendra had selected that one, and ultimately we went with this one.
So what happened with that? I mean,
I think ultimately we just decided this might be a better
Okay.
cover, but it is a really powerful image.
it
Perhaps
is.
we can talk about that.
I also imagine that that image was cheaper.
Although ultimately we paid for that one.
Yeah,
too,
we
so
paid for
have
this one
rights to
too,
this
so yeah.
Yeah, that's a really compelling image there.
I think I made the case that this image was more representative of the collection as a whole, because what we have is an African-American World War I veteran who's at a Vietnam War protest.
Right,
Yeah.
right.
So it captures that
Yeah.
generational, trajectory of the history that we're actually talking about. And it also shows that not all veterans support wars.
Right,
Right?
right.
And the actual veteran, the history behind him is somewhat of an intrigue of my own, and I tried to do as much research as I could to find out who he was, what he experienced, but there are gaps, and there are always gaps in
Yeah, yeah.
historical records about marginalized people. So in many ways, that is also symbolic of the larger work too. All right, how's everyone doing? All right. So I have lots of questions prepared, but I'd like to give my students an opportunity to ask anything that they want to ask, or other members of the audience first. Opportunity to ask anything
Bruce.
that they want to ask, or other members of the audience
No.
first. All right. We have a microphone as well. Bruce. And I know my students, I have to let the silence breathe before they actually speak up. We have a microphone as well.
Bruce, can you pick me
And I know my students, I have to let the silence breathe before they actually speak up. We have a mic. There's some delay going on.
Technology is a wonderful thing.
It's going to be my new ringtone.
Anyway, thank you very much. I'm Bruce Pensick. I am the History and Social Sciences librarian here. I'm also the vice president of the Veterans Studies Association. Dr. Kinder used an interesting word with permeability. Dr. Stur raised some interesting questions about the veteran serving military distinction. It's reasonable to suppose that people who are marginalized may try to provide support for other people who are marginalized, such as marginalized veterans trying to help people who are similarly left out who are still in the military. But you're taking an historical view, even if it's simply U.S. history, so far as I can tell. What kind of evidence is there that have you come across that suggests attempts for veterans to support people who are still in the military? Dr. Stur mentioned some of that in the legal defense question, but I'm curious if there's a pattern more generally.
Well, I can speak to it in a couple of different examples. One of the most interesting pieces of evidence I came across in thinking about this specific topic has to do with these veteran chat rooms in which, and sometimes they would be enuresis themed, and sometimes they would be kind of one I read a lot on, it's called leatherneck.com, in which you have past and present veterans, or past veterans and present military personnel sort of talking about the kinds of issues that they face. And these are incredibly intimate discussions, some of which involve saying things like, my boyfriend is a Marine. He came home last night. He was drunk. He was belligerent. He passed out and he wet the bed. What do I do? And you will have veterans and even current contemporary military personnel sort of weighing in, saying, this is what I did. This is what my buddy did. This is where I turned, right? This is the adult diaper company that I choose to endorse. And so you can find a whole lot of that sort of thing. And, well beyond enuresis, where you have veterans supporting other veterans, but also veterans who come to be associated with different mental conditions, different disabilities, kind of speaking out as authorities on those conditions and speaking to others. And I can also think too about, and this segues into Dr. Stur's discussion, about some of those discussions around not just Leonard Matlovich, but also other LGBTQ veterans or service personnel during the Vietnam War. One thing that you can kind of see in reading through magazines like and sort of kind of newspapers like Gay Liberator and other things like that, you'll find a lot of sense of commonality and shared interests between gay personnel of the military, gay veterans, and veterans who are seeking to either get, or personnel seeking to get out of the military, or who are trying to negotiate the legal obstacles associated with war resistance, right? And so you'll have one group of people who have been in many ways outlawed or marginalized from American society, gay and lesbian people, right, speaking directly to others, people who are engaged in anti-war resistance, and back and forth, talking about strategies, but ultimately backing each other up, right? Really saying that, we're on the same side here, and the side, what we're fighting against is a society that doesn't recognize people like us, and that, leads us into conflicts that not only are damaging for other Americans, but are certainly damaging for people around the world, right? And so those are just a few minor examples, but, one could write a whole book about this, and I hope someone does, not me, though.
And I'll add just another example of an organization that was founded by a LGBTQ veteran to help enlisted or active duty personnel and veterans. OutServe is a group that was founded in 2012 by Josh Seafried, who is a former captain in the Air Force, a graduate of the U.S. Air Force Academy, and then after his service became active as far as an LGBT rights activist. And he founded OutServe, and the OutServe merged with the Service Members Legal Defense Network. And after Don't Ask, Don't Tell was repealed and the VA began to develop programming that focused specifically on healthcare issues for LGBTQ personnel and veterans, OutServe began to work with the VA to provide support and information and help create programs that spoke to the particular needs of healthcare needs of LGBTQ veterans. So just another example of organizing an organization that was founded by a veteran and then that partnered with the VA to provide support for service members and veterans.
I can speak about in a regional way, and that is thinking about the Wauchukans Veterans Association that was formed in 1942, and they not only basically were formed as a result of these veterans who served basically at a particular place, Fort Huachuca, during the Second World War, but later on they go on to provide support for basically the members of the Black Panther Party chapter in Cleveland when they're trying to work out, what was going on within their particular neighborhood. And they would go on to extend, even after many of its members had passed on, to extend that type of support to Cleveland veterans who were returning home from basically Desert Storm and the like. These veterans associations are remarkable because they find commonality in how they were treated as on the margins, but they're also giving marginalized people's voices in order to express what is happening to them. They're very receptive in that way. And I think also for Vietnam veterans, they also learn those lessons as well, because just recently I participated in an NEH project in Farmville, Virginia, where they were talking about basically the civil rights movement and also what was happening there in Farmville at the public schools, and who happens to be like some of the central figures in that are veterans who are returning home from Vietnam and helping them to think about strategies for organizing and so forth. In another setting, I talk about how this lesson, and it seems like an enduring lesson for these veterans, all coming basically from all walks of life, they learned this idea of organizing and super organization. And what I mean by that is they are willing to embrace some of the new tactics for trying to reach a broader, basically, sector of the population. We see elements of that, and you could write volumes just about that.
And the more that they talk, the more examples I can think of as well. We open the book by talking about deported veterans. These are non-U.S. citizens who enlist in the U.S. military as a path towards citizenship, but either in the military or afterwards, they get in some type of legal trouble where they may go to jail afterwards or end up in prison, and this happens as a type of double punishment, actually. So Hector Barajas is the leader of a grassroots movement to repatriate deported veterans. He was imprisoned after his military service in 2004, and he organized a movement from Tijuana. So he started organizing deported veterans. And actually the Biden administration has just, introduced some legislation as well as some policies to repatriate deported veterans. So it's a very powerful movement. But the way we open the book is talking about during COVID-19, these are people who don't have access to the VA. So in the absence of traditional support institutions like the Veterans Administration, veterans, to my knowledge, have always banded together, especially marginalized veterans like Black veterans in Vietnam in the era, the National Association for Black Veterans, more recently the Black Veterans Project, which has sued the VA for discrimination against Black veterans after 9/11. So what they found is that Black veterans are more likely to be denied disability benefits. I can give more examples. We conclude the book talking about the I Am Vanessa Guillen movement, in which women in the aftermath of the 2020 brutal murder of Vanessa Guillen at Fort Hood, Texas, started the social media movement under that hashtag and started sharing their own memories of sexual violence. And women in the military, or 1 in 4 women in the military today, are likely to be sexually assaulted by another military personnel without much legal recourse. More often than not, they're actually retaliated against for reporting that trauma. And it's like 12 times more likely that they're punished for reporting rather than the rapist is actually held accountable. And I could think of many more examples of that, but I would just go back to that point that without the VA, without the federal government, even in the military, whenever they have a lack of supplies, soldiers and veterans have always formed bonds with one another, and they support one another. Students, do you have questions? No pressure. Yeah.
I guess this is more of like a generalized question, but during your research, what kind of challenges or like difficulties did you guys come with when you're like researching and collecting data?
That's a great question.
That is a great question.
One of the things for me, because a lot of what I'm dealing with is so recent, either documents are still classified or there's not a clear sense of where to go. They haven't all been collected and put in one place yet. So that, to me, is one of the challenges of doing kind of really recent history. I mean, another thing, because it's so recent, is, you get people like, is this actually history and it's still happening? I mean, I think it is. But just kind of that question is like, is this history? Can you look at this from a historical way? But really, it's just the coming up against material still being classified or not having been, collected and cataloged and put somewhere so you kind of know where to go.
I can also add too that the group I'm looking at, there is no group known as the Enuretic Veterans of America, right? Most people who have, just like people outside the military, people who have the condition of enuresis, bedwetting, they don't like to admit it, right? They're not going to say much about it. They're not going to sort of, let's form an organization. But so for me, what I was looking at, and to some extent you could sort of say this about doing research on all marginalized populations is, there's plenty of documents about the center, right? When we go to the margins, we have to get creative, right? So for me, where did I find them? Well, I found them in all of the government documents that were designed to justify their dismissal. So you can find thousands upon thousands of pages of official military medical documents saying, this is why we don't need them. This is why they're a danger. This is why they're a threat. This is what we should do with them. And we can find the statistics. But how do you search for them after they leave the military, particularly if they're not aligned with or associated with the VA? Well, I had to search for places like Veterans Appeals Courts, and you can find their transcripts online and in various online archives and so forth, where you can, begin to search and find the cases where they. I could also look at, some of the blue discharges, right? Where, you could sort of follow the blue discharges and you could begin to see people pushing back against them and so forth. There were also various kinds of codes and separation numbers that you would get upon leaving the military, and each one would, they were supposed to be private, but, each number stood for a very specific thing, and there were a couple for enuresis, right? So once you found the numbers, then you could start to find the people. But of course, I could finally find them once we entered the internet age, where people start using Facebook, people start using internet chat rooms, people start going online, and people start outing themselves and saying, hey, I have enuresis, my sergeant did this, or I wet the bed, or, I just had surgery because I developed cancer because of Agent Orange exposure, and now I have enuresis, right? And what do I do about that? People are talking about it now. People are less squeamish about it. People aren't going to say, I'm not going to go into a corner and hide because you are freaked out by this medical condition or this physical condition that I just happen to have, right? I'm not going to let you do that to me with just because I make you uncomfortable. And the more people think like that, the more people are willing to talk, and the more people are willing to engage, especially online.
I want to talk about this before the internet age, because when I first started working on African Americans in the military, as soon as I said I was going to do that, people were saying, well, you're not going to find anybody who works in this area. You're not going to find anybody. In my case, I was working on the U.S. 93rd Infantry Division. They said, you're not going to find many of the individuals who served in that division. So what I did was I started sending out letters to veterans organizations, started sending letters out to basically some of the national black weeklies, and before you knew it, people were starting to flock and wanted to talk about, I was being sought out to talk about their experiences. Plus, I also had to think outside the box, sort of. Like, I knew with the military, they had rosters. They have rosters of all of their personnel. I knew if I went down the names of those rosters, I could match them up according to where they were, according to the numbers of where they were basically coming from. I used that in order to build a database for all of these individuals. You have to think in innovative ways about how to basically to approach these individuals. Because if you have the questions in mind, trust me, they're gonna come to you. They're gonna want to talk about it. The other thing is that in this age that we live in the internet, I've found that not only are you going to be able to find information more readily, but you're also going to be able to go below that information in order to find out where the communities where these people are. That is to me, that's one of the most important things about doing this type of research. We want to know. We just don't want to know about the units they served in, what kinds of military justice that they have encountered and so forth. We want to know the flesh and blood individuals of these people there. Who are they? I think that's one of the most interesting things about doing this type of research.
And so, my mic'd. And some of my students are going to be doing oral history interviews next week. And so I really appreciate what you said earlier about one of the veterans you interviewed talking about our history, because there is shared authority in that. There's a responsibility that comes with telling these histories of marginalized people truthfully, honestly, and ethically, right? Dr. Jefferson, I want to go back to you. I have a question for you, because I want to make this relevant to the lives of the students in the audience today who are, between 18 and 22 years old. They just experienced a global pandemic. We've witnessed protests in the wake of George Floyd's murder. The image you see on the screen is veterans who put their bodies in front and between police lines and people who were protesting police brutality. And so my question for you is, we see a false dichotomy in recent public discourse about social justice movements and patriotism. For example, when black athletes like Colin Kaepernick protest police brutality, they're often called unpatriotic, disrespectful to Americans and to the troops. And I'm curious, what do you think that Jesse Frazier would say about the relationship between racial justice and patriotism?
Well, that's a great question, because I think there are so many parallels that you can draw between the time that we live in now, basically with Black Lives Matter, the movement, and then also the New Negro movement. And I think at the intersection of those two movements, those parallels, are the veterans. They are living and breathing embodiments of the movements in themselves. The veterans, particularly Jesse Frazier, they didn't necessarily use the language of New Negro and what that sensibility was all about, but they walked it. And they would also say to this generation, in terms of thinking about Black Lives Matter, they would say that these are the things that we served, we fought, and we died for. So therefore, for the Colin Kaepernicks of the world, there are so many of them that are walking around. They would be fully in support of them. And I think the same thing could be said for today's veterans as well. I've seen basically these veterans returning home from these basically from these theaters of operation, and they're saying very much the same. They're voicing the same things that basically previous generations of African American soldiers, the same sentiments. They're asking the question of when are we going to realize the true fruits of this lowercase democracy? When are we going to realize the fruits of that? And these movements basically push that forward. They push that question forward more than anything else. It's almost like they're in symbiotic relationship with each other. So I think he would be in full agreement with what is happening now.
We have a mic.
I have a comment and a question. I'm a student who's on the Chapter 35. My mom is a vet, my dad's a vet, my grandfather, like everybody in my family is a vet. So I think this topic itself is very interesting because I've never thought past oh, they're in the Army, they're serving protect. I was like, dang, that's it. But I never really thought past that to think of the history of mistreatment and then what it means for today. So I think this is kind of interesting. And then I'm bad with names, but ma'am, I forgot your name. I'm so sorry. But you talked about don't ask, don't tell.
Don't ask, don't tell. Yep.
Yeah, and I was wondering if something, I know we got overturned by President Trump. I was wondering how that wasn't unconstitutional if you did know, for. If we are already fighting, had a long fight for LGBTQ rights, and if being able to proclaim what you are is constitutional itself, why was it okay for him to overrule it in his presidency, I guess?
Yeah, that's a great question, and it is stunning if you think about it. That was an example. I think I'm right on this. That of the first time in American history that a group that had been given a military right like that had it repealed. So it was a big move for him to do that. Now, as far as I'm not sure exactly what if Congress could have overturned that decision, or now, well, I will say this: it was challenged in the courts. I actually had the opportunity to write an expert witness report for a number of plaintiffs who were suing Trump and the Department of Justice for his overturning of the integration of open service of transgender personnel. So there were legal challenges that were happening, and the sense that I got, so I had a deposition with the Department of Justice lawyer, and in that I got the sense that lawyer realized that Trump didn't have any legs to stand on, and that once it went, if it stopped at a circuit court, or if it went on to the Supreme Court, I don't know, but that the sense was that he was going to fail, or it would be overturned because there were all of these other examples of integration that didn't harm unit cohesion, morale, all of that. So in the expert witness report, I started with African Americans and the integration of black service personnel into the military after World War II. Then I talked about women, and then gays and lesbians, and all of the evidence showing that when integration occurred, unit cohesion didn't decline, morale didn't decline, combat readiness didn't decline. So Trump's decision to overturn the allowing of transgender people to serve openly didn't have any evidence to stand on. Now, that case was in the courts when he lost in 2020, and then when Biden became president, he reissued Obama's legislation that said transgender people could serve openly. So it's a great question.
Hi. First, I just wanted to
say thank you to each of you for coming out and speaking with us today. I really appreciate it. But I was just curious and interested to hear about what really piqued your interest and caused you to dive into the topics that you decided to discuss with us today.
That's a great question.
That is a great.
Thank you.
I can speak for myself here. Well, there's a very famous World War II memoir by a man named Robert Leckie called "Helmet for My Pillow," or "Helmet for a Pillow." Yeah, and basically at one point he sort of says, "There I was on, I think, Guadalcanal, and the rain was coming down, and I experienced this thing called enuresis." And then over the course of the memoir, for the next few pages, he mentions that he has bedwetting. And I had never heard another World War II memoirist ever mention this. And then at the same time, I was doing research on something else, and I came across this strange list that suggested that bedwetting, along with all these other things, were dangerous for and strange and a threat to to hygiene and unit morale and cohesion and all these sort of things. And so I put the two together, and I became really interested in, well, what happened to the Robert Leckies of the world? Why was this so dangerous? And because I sort of thought, like, well, sometimes as historians, we're always looking for our ways into history. And for me, whether it's talking about disabled veterans or talking about zoos in wartime, right? I think some of the most interesting stories come from the most unexpected starts, right? So I knew that, well, this has to be about something bigger, right? So I read a memoir, I read a historical document, I put the two together. And by the way, if you've seen the HBO miniseries, The Pacific, which is partially based on Robert Leckie's memoir, you'll note that there actually is a single episode called Enuresis, in which his story is profiled. So this is one, if not the only one, kind of large Hollywood budget example of a popular culture document that is addressing this topic. So that's a great question.
For me, it was personal because, and I mentioned the Fraser family, but for my own family, my grandfather fought in World War II, and he served at Fort Bragg, and he didn't talk about his wartime service in a glorified way. If I had to describe my grandfather for you, he always kept it real. I mean, he said, this is how it is. This is what it was like. I was a young person. I was 22 years old. I was scared to death. I didn't know what this was all about. But he was from the South. And he also talked about what it meant to be a black Southerner living at the very height of Jim Crow racism and segregation, and how he returned home to South Carolina and realized that although he had been fundamentally changed by his military service, the country wasn't ready for him. And that lesson was one that he imparted to his son, and my father talked about it somewhat. But I always was curious as to where's this all coming from? So when I found that other veterans were talking about their stories, I found that there were parallels between what my grandfather talked about and what they talked about. And I wanted to know more. And most of the time, and the other thing about historians, we talk about basically writing history, but most of the time the history that's being imparted to us comes from other directions, comes from other sources. And that family story just stayed with me throughout much of this time.
Well, for me, my initial interest was in the Vietnam War, and when I was in grad school, and I was began to get curious about what women did in the war. I mean, I knew American women. I knew that they were there, but I wanted to know more about how they served. So I did oral histories, and as I talked to women, I realized that ideas about gender were very crucial to shaping what they were expected to do, whether they were a nurse, they were in the Women's Army Corps, if they served with the Red Cross. And so then that got me thinking about how ideas about gender, ideas about sexuality define how men and women serve in war. And so there's a parallel for men, certain types of masculinity that you're supposed to show if you're a soldier. And that led me to just be more interested in women serving in the military more broadly. And then I got to wonder about, okay, what about other groups whose social position or their cultural position was defined by particular ideas about gender or ideas about sexuality and sexual orientation, and about race. And so then I started looking at different contexts of integration into the U.S. military from, like I said earlier, from African Americans, women, gays and lesbians, transgender people. So it started with the Vietnam War and then kind of got broader in terms of experiences of different groups of people serving in the U.S. military.
As it does. I would just add to that. I know I haven't talked too much about my own research, which is about the history of veterans within the context of mass incarceration. And for me, I didn't approach my research by reading a bunch of books and then finding out, well, no one's really talking about incarcerated veterans, but rather I was looking to the world and listening to the stories around me. And because one thing we argue is that veterans are actually everywhere in society, but they're more invisible. I mean, some will wear a hat, but no one's going to wear a hat that says, I'm a marginalized veteran, or I'm a gay veteran, or I wet my bed. So that the idea that stories were all around us if we're only willing to listen was very compelling to me. And that's what drove me to do oral history interviews. I was meeting veterans as an undergrad working as a waiter in a restaurant and just listening to the stories that they told. But in grad school, I was reading about the Vietnam War, and there were very few books about Black veterans during the Vietnam War. And there still are. There are only 2 or 3 that, to my knowledge, they're really good, but why is it that we have hundreds of volumes about the Civil War? How many biographies do we have of President Lincoln, for example? And yet we have 2 books on Black veterans during the Vietnam War or World War II, as you know, or the First World War. So I was really compelled to change that narrative. I went to an archive because I was thinking that I was going to be able to hear a lot of oral histories from Black Vietnam veterans at Texas Tech's archive, which is one of the biggest Vietnam War archives in the world. And there weren't many. There weren't many at all. And so I started asking, why is that? So I decided to be cliche, to be that change, to go out and record the stories. And I kept coming across stories about Black veterans who came home from Vietnam, were discharged with less than honorable discharges. They didn't have access to the VA. They didn't have disability benefits. They were disproportionately discharged without those benefits, and they went to jail, unsurprisingly. They went to prison during an economic recession. And I thought that was a story that needed to be told.
I just want to say one last thing, and that's that when you, and I think what you said resonates with me really strongly, and that is when you hear one story, then you're curious to find out if there are other stories, and that leads you down this path, and then you start to think about, okay, there's a whole history there that I wasn't aware of, that I really need to try to understand. I think that's what drives us even more so, to try to figure out what it is that's going on behind the scenes. Most of the stories that you hear, they add another dimension to the history that we've already, that you thought you knew. They add another dimension.
Any other questions? Those are really great, and I don't want to use up the time with my own questions. Oh, Malik.
I wanted to ask, as you had researched Jesse's uncle, what have you seen in the difference between his uncle's experience while in the war or in the military and Jesse's?
That's a great question, and that's an excellent question, because as Reuben Frazier was talking about his uncle's experience, he said to me that he was very much unsatisfied. When he left military service, I mentioned that his military career came to an abrupt end. But he was still trying to make some sense out of what it meant to basically serve during that time. And he was, and the way that he used, the measuring stick that he used was his uncle. So by the time he got to, basically he started to mature and he started to reach the latter stages of his life, he started to think about his life as being, in many ways, an extension of his uncle's military service, but in other ways, it was a precursor to what he thought this country, where this country might be or what it might become. And that was the part of that lesson that he was imparting, not only to his, basically to successive generations of his family, but anyone and everyone who would listen to him about what was happening, what had happened to him. So in that sense, I think that your question is a great one, because in some ways he moved further down the road by continuing the story, but then in other ways he extended the struggles of his uncle. That's a great question.
I actually had a similar question written down, so that really is such an insightful
That's
question.
a great question.
Dr. Kinder, I think the onus is on you. I want you to tie everything together for us. What surprises or insights did you have in editing this volume that made you recognize commonalities between disabled veterans, Black veterans, LGBTQ veterans, women veterans, and all of these marginalized groups? Are there similarities that you noted that surprised you?
Well, I'm sure I'm going to offer up a disappointing answer to that.
Really set you up.
You know, I mean, in terms of editing the collection, of course, it's harder than it looks. And, you know, we struggle to, as you said, build something bigger than the sum of its parts. And yet, you know, I think there are some very basic lessons we can take away from this. You know, one is, and this gets to this idea of permeability, which, you know, we sort of think about the military and American society as these separate places, right? These separate institutions. And certainly the military has done a good job of framing itself that way. But of course they're not, right? The U.S. military exists within and through American society. Groups that are already marginalized, already experience prejudice, already experience some kind of social dislocation or economic dislocation. In some ways, it's no surprise that once they get into the military, they encounter something similar. Now, of course, that runs counter to the narrative of democratization that the military has long upheld, which goes something like this. Doesn't matter who you are before you enter into the military. Once you get into the military, you're all equal. You're all the same. There's, you know, you're not white, you're not black, you know, you're green, right? And so this idea is that, you know, once you come into this space, right, you know, you will rise and fall according to your own merits. Just as one should, in theory, rise and fall according to one's own merits within American society. But of course, that's not true, right? You know, humans are humans. They take with them prejudices, ideas, attitudes, perceptions from civilian life into the military, and of course, out of it. So I think one thing that, you know, I hope Veteran Studies, you know, takes from a book like this is just, you know, a further recognition of something that's very simple, which is that, you know, the military doesn't change everything, right? And, you know, we shouldn't be surprised that the military is not a space for unmaking or redressing all of the wrongs that of American society. If anything, the military often amplifies them, exaggerates them, and renders them more traumatic because of the inherent violence associated with wartime service. So, so yeah, that's basically the best I can come up with.
That's pretty good.
Yeah.
Well, I want to thank each of the panelists. I want to thank the crew who made the live stream possible, who will be here for another 2 hours dismantling all of this equipment. And I hope that Joe offers some type of extra coffee in the morning. And again, I want to thank the Center for Humanities for providing the funding necessary to support programs like this. And students, thank you for attending. Again, thank you for your great questions.